It's great to be here. We haven't done one of these Decoding China Zoominars for a while, and we just thought that at the end of the year of a very busy and interesting year around the world, but especially in China, that it was a good time to take stock of what has been happening. I think there's been a lot of confusion about it. There's been quite a bit of uncertainty, and so we all try to do our best to kind of wade through some of that. Can't guarantee that we have all the answers, but we will do our best to kind of give you our best perspectives and views on what's going on. After all, that's basically kind of our jobs daily, to kind of think about and figure out what's going on, and to also give you guys a way to perhaps think about what is happening and what may be coming around the corner in China over the next few months or next year. And so, I know this is billed as all things China, but we're really just going to focus on the politics, the political and the economic dimensions, because there's just too much to cover. And we'll definitely give everyone plenty of time to ask questions on here, and maybe we'll even try to do some Q&A on Twitter afterwards if there's interest. And also, just you can probably tell we're doing a little bit of different format. Rather than just talking to you, Hilton and I decided it was best if we just had a conversation about what's going on, and kind of ask us each questions and kind of giving our takes back and forth. Mm-hmm. We just wanted to talk through, because some of it's helpful for us to also think about in real time what's actually going on. So to begin with, let's recap off some of the big things that has happened on the political and the economic side. So on the economic side, I would say the three big things is probably the tech crackdown that's happened that's happened several months, but it seems to have petered out, and we've written on that. Then there was the property crisis, tied to Evergrande, and now it's kind of percolating beyond that a little bit. And then the third piece is sort of the energy crunch, which also seems to be turning around a little bit now. But those were probably the three key things that happened economically, and I think you would agree. And then on the political side, you started off the year with the National People's Congress, where they unveiled the 14th five-year plan and the 2035 long-range plan. Mm-hmm. That's something we're going to be spending a lot of time talking a little about, because I think that has a lot to do with what's happening right now. And then there's the centenary celebration, 100 years of the Communist Party, and with Xi's big speech. We'll talk a little about that. And of course, now what's happening right now as we speak is the 6th plenum. Exactly. Right. And so those are probably the three big things on the political side. So let's start with the politics side of things, because we're about to learn what the resolution will be coming out of the 6th plenum. So, there's a lot of communist and Marxist jargon coming out of this. What is the historic resolution? Why do they need to do one? Should people even care? What is it? And it's only been done 3 times before. So here's kind of my quick view and take on that, on the 6th plenum. I think one, the very fact that Xi Jinping is sort of only the third leader to have a historic resolution, after Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong before them. One was Mao's was in 1945, I believe, and Deng Xiaoping was in 1981, I believe. And I think one of the purposes of this is that he's essentially putting himself onto the Mount Rushmore of Chinese leaders.
Yeah, in a sense, yes.
In a sense, if China had a Mount Rushmore, or maybe, I don't know, I don't think the Yellow Mountains, you can really carve anything on there, but, whatever the Mount Rushmore of Chinese politics may be. And so you have Mao, who essentially is viewed as a war hero, liberator of China. Deng Xiaoping paved the way for the economy as it is today, made China, some people say made China wealthier, and Xi Jinping sort of here to make China more powerful and strong. I guess the key question is, the American Mount Rushmore has four leaders on there, sort of like who is going to be the next person on the Mount Rushmore, and that's something we will talk about, and that's going to be interesting next year, because we're entering a very political year in 2022. So one is sort of he puts himself into the pantheon, and the second thing I think is he's also been creating a national myth around China and around the Communist Party, and he's been doing that I think ever since he launched the Chinese Dream, but it's really intensified throughout his 9 years so far, and I think it's important, and we'll go into why it's important to create a national myth. But essentially, to me, that national myth, the Cliff Notes version of that is basically, and you heard some of that in the speech he gave at the celebration, which was, okay, China was born 5,000 years ago, and then several thousand years passed, nothing really happened. And then 1840, Opium War, China was weak, China was down, and then for the next 80 years, they tried a bunch of different experiments politically and economically, didn't work, was still weak. Mm-hmm. And then 1921, the Communist Party comes along and sort of, shepherds China out of weakness. Mm-hmm. So that's a very simplified version, but I think it's compelling in the sense that it is simplistic, mm-hmm. and it allows people to rally around it. And he's been doing that, and I expect a lot of that national rejuvenation language to come out of the sixth plenum as well, obviously. And then I would say probably finally, the key question though is still, why do a historic resolution?
Exactly.
Right, because Mao had a very distinct purpose back then because he wanted to consolidate his power.
Yeah, right before the Civil War.
That's right, and he wanted to kind of vanquish a political opponent. So mm-hmm. he used that as a pretty strong political instrument. Mm-hmm. And Dunn, when he did it, he was trying to, put the Cultural Revolution behind him. Mm-hmm. In that sense, he was really trying to put the past behind China to be able to move forward. And he used the resolution to basically launch reform and opening, mm-hmm. right, to make it politically safe to launch a very a profound economic transition. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't look like Xi necessarily needs to consolidate that much more power at this point. Mm-hmm. So, other than putting himself on the Mount Rushmore, what do you think he's resolving history for?
Yeah, I don't think we know the full set of reasons why he and the Communist Party decided to do that. But I would just highlight one factor. Basically, if you're looking back, that basically 10 years ago, back in 2013, that they also, around that time, there was also kind of like, in terms of their overall policy direction, they were at a inflection point. Back then, they signaled they're determined to change the economic growth model by launching this 60-point, highly ambitious economic and political reform package.
That was 2013. I remember 2013, everybody had a lot of expectations attached to that 60 points back in the day. Yeah.
But in the years afterwards, the progress had been underwhelming, to say the best. So I guess in one of the reasons why now this time they want to do this historical resolution is really want to use this as a means to help them to push through to implement the reform they are planning for the next decade. Basically, in other words, basically they want to resolve the history is basically to resolve their new principal contradiction.
Okay, so the principal contradiction, that's another kind of mm-hmm. jargony Communist Party speak. Mm-hmm. That was the key decision, I think, in 2017 at the 19th mm-hmm. Party Congress, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe elaborate, what's so important about the principal contradiction?
I think at first look, they're actually quite similar to their previous principal contradiction. This time they basically just add, previously has been that the contradiction between people's desire for better life and insufficient development. Now they redefined it as people's desire for better life with both unequal and underdevelopment. So basically just adding this inequality dimension into this principal contradiction. And the recent policy moves like common prosperity just also highlights the importance of this idea of equality and addressing inequality in their future policy directions, as it gets sense.
So let's stay on that a little bit, because I think there's been a lot of, as I think everyone's seen, there's been a lot of interpretation of common prosperity, mm-hmm. a lot of commentary on it. I actually just published a piece this morning mm-hmm. trying to give my own uncommon theory mm-hmm. on it. And but let's stay on this common or this principal contradiction idea a little bit. Once you resolve it, what's sort of the end goal? What sort of, can we make that concrete? Like, what are they actually talking about when they say, okay, you resolve the principal contradiction? Yeah. What does that lead to? What's the end goal?
Yeah, I think all those recent policy ideas like common prosperity, I think they are in one sense all means to achieve this one end. And this one end basically can be summarized into two numbers. Basically, just on per capita levels that China wants to its per capita income to be around $25,000 by the year 2035. That's in constant today's dollar. So, and in aggregate, multiplying by China's 1 billion plus population, this means China will become a 30+ trillion economy and very likely to be the world's largest economy by the year of 2035. So that's basically what they define as their end goals.
So that's essentially the 2035 long-range plan.
Yes.
So from now, so in 15 years, China essentially wants to, so $30 trillion economy, $25,000 per capita GDP, which if I recall, that puts you sort of close to where, you know, Taiwan's per capita GDP is recently.
Yeah, roughly.
A little bit lower than that.
Yeah, roughly.
So it's essentially sort of getting to Taiwan economically speaking.
Or you look at China among Chinese regions, that will be probably the level of living standard in places like Shanghai. So basically making the entire country.
So it's more getting to Shanghai.
Yeah.
Is Shanghai roughly about 25?
Yes.
Yeah, roughly. Okay. So it's about it's converging to Shanghai. Okay. So I think that's helpful to concretize those 30 trillion, and $25,000 per capita GDP. But so that doesn't necessitate, you know, more growth. I mean, when you're debating common and prosperity, doesn't that kind of fall into kind of the prosperity column where you still have to get a certain amount of growth to essentially, you know, grow the cake rather than thinking too hard about dividing the cake right away?
Yes, I think in some sense, my understanding is that they now emphasize more about this inequality dimension. It's really the necessity is that China is already a pretty unequal society. So, and the general rule is that as the economy further grows, inequality probably will only get worse. So they want to tackle the inequality problem now instead of waiting for another 10 years when the problem was even worse, will be much worse. And moreover, I think there's also that emphasizing the inequality dimension, addressing inequality can in some sense also helping them to better achieve their growth goals, in the sense that a large section of the Chinese population, for example, the rural population, their current income is basically like probably a third of the average urban income. If you can somehow manage to close, for example, this rural-urban income gap from like 3 to 2, that will actually mean enormous new source of growth and new source of consumption demand. So which will help them better to achieve their growth target. That's my understanding.
So then what's with all the, so with the sort of, you know, basic idea is you gotta, you know, you've got to essentially, I think what you're saying is you gotta kind of dramatically dial back some of the current growth drivers, the pistons, the engines of growth, and you gotta, and you know, Xi administration, they've already hinted strongly at that. Whether they've succeeded or whether they've executed it well, that's another debate, but they've sort of, they got rid of the growth target, right, in the 14th five-year plan, which was quite a surprise.
Yes.
And I think you and I both agree that they've been more tolerant of austerity than I think people give them credit for. But the problem is when, you know, coming to some of the big things that we talked about, tech crackdown, or the economic tech crackdown, energy crunch, and property. I mean, those seem to, you know, every time they try to do something, it seems like it brings some volatility to the markets, and people get kind of, you know, for lack of a better term, a bit freaked out. So how should we sort of, you know, what are they trying to, you know, how do you shut off the current growth drivers, I guess safely? Can you do that?
Well, I think my sense is that is probably, even if they eventually achieve all their goals, this process probably will be kind of like volatile. So there will be always be risks coming both from like policy, like Beijing deliberately pushing forward certain policy, like the recent examples, like offsets, regulatory policy, and also like from areas such like that because they are preoccupied with certain policy agendas, so they neglect other part of the economy. For example, the recent example of the energy shortage only become that the energy shortage become basically a regional blackout, that they began to really pay attention to address this problem. So yeah, my guess is that looking forward, as they pushing this really ambitious set of the policies, I think there probably will be higher level of volatilities going forward. Yeah.
But don't you think this whole process, though, if it's as profound as we think it's going to be, it's certainly, you know, or possibly disruptive in you know, in many ways. Don't you have to kind of politically prepare?
Yes, exactly.
The country, both the political class and the middle class, that we're trying to do this. It's going to be really challenging, and there are probably going to be some losers coming out of this. And so, and there will obviously be pushback. Couldn't we also interpret common prosperity sort of as serving a political purpose, saying, well, this is going to be tough, and when things do get tough, well, don't worry about it. We're doing it for common prosperity.
Yeah, exactly.
We're pulling together for common prosperity. At the end of it, it's going to be collective prosperity, even though you're going to be losing some stuff right now. You know, I think one clear possible loser is probably local governments, you know, in terms of fiscal revenue. And the fact that they've lost, I think, a very clear single target.
Exactly, the GDP target.
The metric, right?
Yes.
And
which is a very measurable objective target.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's like getting like 100 on your you know, high school or college entrance exam, right? It's exactly. like that. That's a number. So when they get rid of that number, what do local governments do? Like, how do they know what to do?
I think, yeah, that's a really good question. That basically previously their task and their progress can be pretty easily measured, basically in either GDP or investment. But going forward, it's probably more likely that local governments, their mandates will be more about like providing better public services to the local people, which is actually not that easy to measure. For example, especially from how, for example, higher level authority, they probably will not know how, for example, the local people feel about their education and healthcare services. What they can measure is probably input, like how much local government spend in these areas. But the output is really hard to measure.
Well, I think it's hard for any government, for any country that size to really measure concretely, do sort of post hoc assessments of output, measuring, you know, basically effectiveness. But I think this is tough because you know, you're essentially asking kind of, you know, the entire Chinese polity, the local governments, everyone down to start to deploy capital less into sort of what I might call GDP maximizing projects and efforts, and start to deploy them toward quality of life kind of projects and areas and services. But quality of life is, again, as you say, it's less quantifiable. It's a bit subjective, you know, what quality of life means to certain people, and obviously with the you know, income disparity across China, quality of life can mean very different things in Ningxia versus you know, Shanghai. Yeah. Right. So, but I think it's important to understand, right, because at the heart of sort of what we said earlier about the 30 trillion. Getting to 30 trillion, 25,000. Once you get there, you're going to have one of the world's biggest middle class, right? Yes. I think there's no doubt about that. So when you have the middle class, I think the Communist Party realizes that expectations will change pretty dramatically, and they already have to some extent. But if you keep on expanding the middle class, and you have to kind of I think the government is hoping to preempt the shift in expectations, broadly speaking, and so they're trying to do that. But it's, you know, but what I guess the question for a lot of people is, you know, this seems to be something they've decided to do. This seems to be something that they've now tried coming out of the sixth plenum, and even over the last few years, they've tried to kind of politically messaging wise, trying to prepare the country for, well, we're trying to do something pretty big and substantial, and it could be, just be prepared. There could be some collateral damage. But what are we talking about though, in terms of, then how do we think about growth prospects for China over the next, 4 to 5 years? I know it's very hard to predict. Are we looking at a dramatic slowdown, or are we looking at, what are some, I guess, what would be like the toughest part to do, you think, in this transition? Of all the things they have to do, what would be sort of the most challenging part to kind of reset this growth model?
My sense is really changing local government, local officials' incentives, and they're basically their entire job description will be rewrite for the local officials. And to get it right, we all know that sure they need to pay more attention to providing better services, but how to do that is really challenging. And I think they probably haven't figured out already. They probably will take them some time to, if ever, to figure this out. Yeah.
But how do they address kind of the regional inequality issue that you talked about? And I know you've written a lot on that. It's sort of like there's the Rust Belt problem in China, just like it's, we have a Rust Belt problem in America too. But those things take decades to reverse. Once a region is sort of declining, it's very hard, because I think, based on market forces, labor is going to want to move to, they're going to want to move to Shanghai or Beijing or other places. But those cities, they don't want more people either, right? Because they want people to move to other cities. So how's that really going to work? That seems to be a very, very, very thorny issue to solve. How to make convergence among different regions in China.
I think they are basically what it now do is to redefining regional equality. What this means. Previously, they basically defined as equalization of GDP per capita. For example, Guizhou eventually needs to have similar GDP per capita as Shanghai. Okay. And basically, during the past 2 decades, they have been working hard towards these goals. But
it hasn't worked.
Yeah, they haven't worked. And I think in recent years, they began to acknowledge the ineffectiveness of this previous strategy. And now they basically, I think, they are now redefining the regional convergency target as convergency in the quality of public services across the country. So basically, that means that regardless of where you live, that you basically have access to similar qualities of basic public service, like basic education and basic health care. And I think that's a goal that currently working on. And this has a much higher, in my opinion, chance of success than the previous goals of like equalizing income across regions.
So again, this goes back to the idea of reallocating capital away from sort of GDP maximizing, but investing. It's still investment, but investing in sort of the right kinds of things. That
also you can define it basically from physical capital to human capital, because education and healthcare.
Right. So human capital. I want to get back to human capital because I think that's really interesting. Okay, so they have this fairly significant transition that they're trying to manage, and I guess that's kind of what's going to happen starting after 2022, the political transition, which we can talk a little bit more about maybe in the Q&A. But so what will the Chinese government try to kind of model this whole process after? Because I think, a lot of what we're talking about, sort of like, okay, you get rid of the GDP, you're changing incentives on local governments, you give them more vague metrics, you're telling them to converge on public service investment, but nobody really quite knows how to do that. So where's that model? How do they tell people, this is what you should be doing? Because with the centralization, like the local governments are looking for, if I do this, is this common prosperity? If I do that, is that common prosperity? So do they have a model in mind?
Yeah, I think they sort of has a model, which is basically Zhejiang, which is a coastal province in China. So during summer, they launched this policy reform package for Zhejiang to become basically a pilot zone, like for experimenting common prosperity, and they have outlined a few concrete goals for Zhejiang to achieve.
Why Zhejiang? What's special? What features of Zhejiang make it a model pilot zone for common prosperity?
In some sense, Zhejiang is kind of like the low, relatively low income inequality. Not only income inequality, but also like rural-urban inequality and cross-city inequality within Zhejiang. So Zhejiang has basically, among all Chinese regions, has the higher chance of achieving common prosperity.
But Zhejiang is also one of the wealthier provinces.
Yes,
right?
exactly. Also providing more resource for redistribution. Yeah.
Okay, so it's what top 5, top 6 province in terms of average GDP.
Top 5. Yeah.
But you're saying regionally, it's also more equal than some of the other wealthier provinces.
Yes.
So I guess so. So basically they're saying it's achieved the prosperity part, and it's also pretty good on the common part. So therefore we should have Zhejiang. But so here's the thing about Zhejiang though. Zhejiang has one of the most dynamic and entrepreneurial several entrepreneurial cities. Wenzhou, Yiwu, I mean,
Hangzhou, Alibaba.
Alibaba's there, big tech's there. You have a bunch of, everyone says, Wenzhou are some of the most entrepreneurial people in China. So it seems very private sector, small, medium business driven.
Exactly.
So then if that's the pilot, then kind of where's the state role? And, why are people so concerned that the state is going to play a much bigger role in the economy or as part of this common prosperity push?
I think, definitely, as you mentioned, that Zhejiang has benefited greatly from its highly vibrant, dynamic private sector, and which help it to lower income inequality compared to other Chinese regions. So I think going forward, if Zhejiang really eventually wants to achieve a more equal outcome, I think the private sector will be an indispensable part of that. I think the local government can set a few directions, for example, especially in terms of providing more equal access to public service across countries. But in terms of promoting income convergence across countries, it really depends, I think, heavily on developing the private sector, especially in those relatively backward parts of Zhejiang. Yeah.
Okay. So then let's think about it this way. So Zhejiang is going to be sort of the future growth model, or that's the pilot zone for the future. I guess you could argue that, what Shenzhen has become today, that was sort of the...
Zhejiang's role in for the next decade.
Right, Shenzhen was sort of the original, the OG pilot zone, if you will, right? That kind of defined the current growth model, and it's built on this, everyone knows Shenzhen's origin story. It was a swamp, it was a fishing village, and now it's sort of, the tech hub. But I think one can make the case that Shenzhen now is also a fairly unequal city, right? It's got, and you have written on that, it's got sort of echoes of housing problems like in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. And so when you talk about human capital, I mean, any tech hub, it runs on human capital. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen to Shenzhen if all these young people, young talent, that they're going to get priced out of Shenzhen? And you say Shenzhen housing is kind of converging with Hong Kong, or might even be more expensive than Hong Kong, right?
Yeah, it's converging rapidly to Hong Kong's level.
Right. So how are they going to deal with the human capital issue? I guess are we to expect a lot of people to go to what are other cities that the tech talent can go to? Right now, I know in the US you have a huge competition with Austin and Miami, with San Francisco, right? Texas is trying to get a lot of tech there, Florida too. So there's a lot of city competition now. New York too, right? They want to, I think the new mayor said he wants New York to be the cryptocurrency capital or whatever. So what would be the Austin and Miami of China? After Shenzhen, where are they going to go?
There are a couple more cities, maybe 5, probably no more than 10 cities that have plenty of job opportunities, especially jobs in those high-tech emerging sector, while they have like relatively affordable housing. For example, I would name a few, like for example, Hefei is basically a city in the Anhui, which is an inland provinces. It has
Hefei, really?
Yeah, it's
Hefei.
Yeah, Hefei.
What's special about Hefei?
I would say Hefei has, for one thing, to starting point, that Hefei has a great research university at the China Science and Technology University.
Okay.
And also Hefei has been kind of like lucky in that about 10 years ago, they decided to be all in to support this Chinese display manufacturing called BOE, which is
that's the high-end OLED display.
Yes.
We've written about that.
Yeah, we have written and analyzed its supply chains.
They're basically competitive with Samsung.
It's now began to supply screens for iPhones. Okay. So it's definitely one of the top players in the world.
Really, Hefei, huh?
Yeah. So which actually allows them to later on to the initial success with BOE allows them to later because OLED and those displays, they're kind of like, they also use a lot of semiconductors, which gives them a good foundation to develop like memory chips, which is also semiconductor.
Right.
And they use it basically, and then more recently, they are now also entering into the new energy vehicle space. Yeah.
Oh, right. NIO.
NIO, yes.
NIO's based there, right?
It's probably half of NIO's manufacturing is in Hefei.
Okay, so do they have aspirations to become sort of the EV capital?
Yeah, I guess, not Hefei and probably another 10 other tiny cities.
There's a lot of competition there, but at least they have NIO.
Yeah.
Okay, so they have EVs. They're trying to do memory chips, and they have OLED displays.
Yes.
Hefei, huh? Isn't Anhui one of the? It used to be one of the poorest provinces.
Yes, it's mostly agriculture, so which makes one of the lowest income in the country. Yeah.
And was it Hu Jintao that was from there, or?
Yeah, Hu Jintao. I think I'm not sure it's Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao. I think his hometown is in Jiangsu. Hu Jintao. Okay,
so Hefei, any others that could make a bid for sort of like, okay, Shenzhen's too expensive, Shanghai's too expensive, or even if Shanghai's not expensive, they have a pretty restrictive population control policy. They don't want people to go in there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. What about cities like Chengdu or like what about even Wuhan? Because obviously there's everyone knows about Wuhan now because of COVID, but I mean, Wuhan also has a very good university, right?
Yeah, Wuhan has good research universities, and also it has one of the largest memory chip manufacturer in China. Yeah, and also like you said, Chengdu, Chongqing, probably Chongqing as well. So there's one very high level plan to basically develop the Chengdu and Chongqing into another pillar, basically the economic center for the western part of China. So and also I would mention that Suzhou, which is basically next door to Shanghai, it's also actually has probably in terms of high tech industry, I think it's in some levels competitive to Shenzhen. For example, it has probably the most public listed high tech firms in China among all the cities, probably just shy of Beijing and Shanghai.
Suzhou?
Yeah, it's probably number 3 or number 4. Yeah.
Is it mostly? Is it a specific sector? Is it biotech? Is it?
Biotech, semiconductors. Yeah, Suzhou basically has kind of like balanced a distribution of all those high tech industries. Yeah.
But Suzhou is also part of the it's part of the pilotism, is it not?
Yes, it belongs to a few pilots, especially now. Beijing's one of the top priorities really to develop the Yangtze Delta region. So basically the greater Shanghai region into one of the future engines for growth. It's already one of the engines of growth. Just want to play a even more instrumental role in driving China's future growth. And Suzhou will definitely benefit, especially as you mentioned that Shanghai is now limiting its population growth, which will drive some of the talents to Suzhou. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe that's one way to at least start to try to equalize some of the regions, just to develop those new sort of identify areas that's going to be sort of new economy focused cities, and try to invest in that in terms of both from education, public services. But I guess this also kind of still means kind of the Rust Belt is still somewhat screwed, right?
Yes,
It's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to turn that around.
Especially if you consider that both the pressure for decarbonization and the property adjustment will affect those like steel, cement, and coal. Those sectors are heavily concentrated in those like Rust Belt regions. So they will shoulder disproportional pain for adjustment in both from the decarbonization adjustment and the property adjustment.
Okay. And one thing I should mention, going back to Zhejiang as sort of the new pilot zone, Zhejiang, given all the private enterprise, it's also a hub where a lot of permanent magnets are manufactured. It's got some big players manufacturing in China. China manufactures a lot of the world's permanent magnets, and in fact, we're going to come out with a case study on that soon. So look out for that. But that's another industry I think that's part of sort of the input into the new new energy economy, basically. So we've covered a lot of territory, and part of this is try to engage with whoever's on listening in, tuning in, and we want to try to address some questions. And I think we've already been collecting some. And so I will just try to go through them and see what we can answer over the next 20 minutes or so. All right, let's see. We have a lot of questions. Let me see. They're all coming in on our phone. Okay. What are the questions? Okay. I don't know if we can answer this, but we can try. Is there anything we can say about the Singles Day that's coming up tomorrow, 11/11?
Yeah.
Is there anything that's is it gonna be a low performing Singles Day because of what's been happening in China? Do you think?
I think it's probably will be an average in terms of like, for example, past, my guess is that the average performance like 15-20% growth year on year. My guess is this year probably will be similar, especially considering that because of now that COVID is kind of like COVID cases now on 40-50 per day. So my guess is that probably pushing more demand and consumption to online. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's see. Right, I think we went over this a little bit. So maybe let's just take a little bit of the question about the two figures that matter: 30 trillion, $25,000 per capita GDP. There's definitely going to be a lot of changes to be able to get there. So maybe we can elaborate a little bit on kind of the risk side of things. What for example, I know you've working on something on property too, but just thinking about what that might look like when you're trying to maybe not shut down, but drastically dial back some of the current growth engines.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. But basically, China in the decades ahead faces a few headwinds to growth. One is property. The other will be local government debt, and third will probably be the decarbonization, which both will force very painful reforms. But on the silver lining is actually those three headwinds. They're basically essentially one. They're basically about construction. Local debt is really about, it's to a large extent about reducing local government's spending, excessive spending, which is ultimately financed by land sale. And decarbonization is actually also primarily about construction and construction materials like steel, cement, and my sense is that property will definitely slow down, but it's also important to know kind of like how much it will fall. So on the one hand, so if you look at the aggregate number, both the aggregate urbanization ratio, which is almost 65, which means almost 2/3 of Chinese already live in cities. And also, if you look at like the people, the young people who are entering into job market each year, who are also the primary age group that will for property purchase, that group the size of that group will decline probably by 20-25% over the next decade. So both these headline numbers are bad for property demand. But on the other hand, we believe there continue to be fairly large internal migrations into people basically moving out of those Rust Belt and declining cities to the more prosperity and dynamic city like the city we just mentioned. During the past decade, just considering the working age population alone, that those growth cities, those sites of growth cities attract close to 50 million of working age population. And if you add their dependents and their parents, so that's the total number of this internal migration is probably close to 100 million. And my guess is.
So you mean just going from lower poor cities?
Poor cities, yeah.
Yeah, about 100 million people.
Yeah, exactly. So this will not help to improve the aggregate urbanization because it's basically moving from one city to another.
Yeah.
But in this process, it will
just music chairs.
It will
cities.
Generate sufficient property demand, especially property demand in those like growth cities. So therefore my guess is that probably my medium longer term outlook is that property demand probably will fall, but it probably will fall by maybe 30%. But that only means it will fall back to these levels about a decade ago, around basically 2011, 2012. Yeah, going forward, maybe 2030, 2040, maybe it fall much further. But my guess is that in the medium term, which means next 5-10 years, it probably might fall by 30%. But this only means that it's fall back to its 2011-12 levels, which actually provide sufficient demand in the years ahead. Yeah. So there will be some pain, but probably not as large as many people expected. Yeah.
Well, that's a bit of a different take, because why do you say that a little bit? I mean, why do you think the impact will be less significant than people think?
Yeah, because one thing is that this migration from like shrinking cities to growth cities, this will create property demand. And moreover, that property actually more expensive in those growth cities. So actually, if you look at the aggregate land sale revenue, my guess is that currently last year it was probably a peak, which is close to 8%. My guess is that over the long, for example, 5 to 10 years from now, it probably will settle somewhere between 5 to 6. So which is much lower than its current level, but it's basically the average of China during the earlier decades from like early 2000s. So.
And how should we think about the property tax in the context of all this? Is it going to be meaningful? I know it's obviously been controversial. They've been talking about it for maybe a decade at least. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not a national tax. So how should we think about that? Is that going to have an impact or not really?
It will have somewhat moderate impact, my sense is that, because for one thing, the starting point that China's property problem is really about on the supply side. The local government limit their supply to sell for high price. It's really not so much on the demand side. Sure, we all heard anecdotal stories of people have 10 or 20 apartments, but that's only a tiny minority. So, and property tax will only primarily address the problem at the demand side, so discourage people from invest too much in property. But moreover, I think property tax, in terms of revenue it provided, probably will not be able to compensate for the fall in land sale. So my outlook is that property tax probably will be able to collect around 1% of GDP, which is roughly the size of the personal income tax. So,
okay, so let me stop you there just briefly. So sorry to interrupt, but I think that's the interesting point. Is how do you make up for the revenue shortfall? I mean, that I think that's the key linkage is that property is so much tied to the fiscal prospects of local government across China. It's almost less about how much it contributes to the GDP, but it's more about that's kind of the local government bread and butter. So if you're going to take some of that bread and butter away, what are you going to replace it with? And if the property tax is not going to be sufficient, how do they manage that process?
I think one is that the fall in land sale will, as I mentioned, will be highly unequal across regions. Which means that coastal regions probably will continue to enjoy a growth in their land sale revenue. So which means that probably there requires a greater amount of central government cross-region transfers.
Okay.
So basically collecting more money from coastal regions like Guangdong and Zhejiang and transfer them to inland provinces. And my guess is that
so it's more provincial redistribution.
Yes.
On a fiscal sense than sort of income redistribution.
Yes.
Okay. And the wealthier provinces are going to be okay with that?
I think that certainly they're not very happy with this. As such, I think the process will be kind of like gradual, but they have already doing this kind of like transfers in terms of like social safety financing, because all those many inland provinces, they have already underfunded their social security fund. So which requires the central government to collect some of the surplus from coastal regions to and transfer. And this is already has been ongoing for a few years.
Okay. So, okay, on property, we can talk more about property, but let me get to some other questions. We talked a lot about property. Okay, so there are a couple fairly concrete questions. How long do we think, we didn't talk about this, but obviously people are wondering about it. How long do we think the COVID zero tolerance policy will be in place, and at what cost? We talk about it, here all the time. And I think we kind of answered that, but we can talk more about it. How will the middle income trap be avoided? And so the first one, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but we tend to think, I think there will be some loosening probably toward the end of 2022.
Yeah, after the conclusion of the 20th. Yeah.
Right. So I think they are going to hold fast to that for the better part of next year. There's not really too many signs that they're going to change that, and they're not really accepting a lot of the vaccine imports. And so I think that's going to be the reality. And I think there's not a lot of incentive to really loosen it during a political year when you have a lot of major, political transitions happening. So I think we're looking at, fourth quarter, end of 2022, roughly. So about a year from now. And the second question is about the middle income trap, which we kind of talk a little bit about, but I guess, the simple answer is that resolving the principal contradiction and reaching that $25,000 per capita definitely puts China into high income country club.
Yes.
That elite club of high income countries. So I guess that's one way to do it. And I guess one can argue that I guess it's sort of like from now to then, does China sort of get stuck in this kind of range of $11,000, $12,000 and $25,000? And so how, what do we think about that? And I guess that's really what they're trying to do to avoid being stuck in this, $12,000 to $25,000 range.
Yeah, there are definitely downside risk to the outlook of China's growth rate. So basically, in terms just if you narrowly about the achieving high income country status, I think that's a pretty easy question, and I think China is probably going to qualify as a high income country probably this year or maybe next. And so the question is really about whether China can maintain decent growth in the decades. There are definitely headwinds, but on the other hand, I think there are also reasons to be optimistic. For example, like I mentioned, there are really like the rural-urban income difference. If they can manage to narrow that income ratio, and it will mean a significant boost in future growth. And I think that's why they are caring so much about the lower income people in recent years. I think they're really now increasingly seeing them as a new source for future growth. And this is actually quite sizable.
I think by low, what's their definition of low income?
Low income because, for example, last year, Premier Li Keqiang has made headlines by saying that close to 600 million people,
that's right, I remember,
their monthly disposable income is less than 1,000 RMB, which is about 150. So which means their yearly disposable income is less than 2,000. So there are 600 million.
2,000 US dollars.
Yeah, annual. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the income bracket they're trying to target.
Yeah, exactly.
To bring them up, what, double that or?
Yeah, double. Yeah, maybe. I think it's a reason to assume it can, with the right policy, the income of this group can double in 10, 15 years. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So they're gonna. So I guess the bottom line is, they will be a high income country pretty soon, like by the official definition. But the key is sort of, can they keep on going, or can they keep on going and not get stuck at sort of a low end of the high income?
Yeah.
And get to that 25,000. 25,000. Okay. In the interest of time, let me just take a few more questions. We didn't touch on sort of, we talked a little bit about climate and decarbonization. I think there's a question about whether there's any connection between a common prosperity agenda and the ecological civilization narrative. Will the new drivers of Chinese growth be lower emissions drivers, or will emissions be a constraint on long-term growth? So I think, this is a very fascinating question, and frankly, something that we're going to be looking more into as well, is the linkage between or not linkage, but the economic impact of decarbonization, which I think is something that I think not just China, but the United States and many other countries will be thinking through about both the economic impact, kind of the jobs impact. And so there's a lot of things to tackle there. But I will say that I think, the bottom line is China, I think, is extremely committed to their two climate goals. They haven't been more ambitious than that, because I think they already believe internally that this is about as ambitious as they can be. The carbon peaking goal and also the 2060 net zero goal. And so they definitely haven't deviated from that commitment. And I think there is, at least among certain policy, the policy class in Beijing, they really believe that this is potentially a time for China to lead on a lot of these, energy technology products, not because they're necessarily the most advanced, but China has been deploying them, massively to scale, both domestically and also around the world, and because I think, the quiet development that I think that's been a little bit overlooked since the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009 is that China has been building these clean tech supply chains in China. And you just have to look at the numbers on solar, wind, and I mentioned magnets before, but those are all kind of inputs into the clean energy economy. And China's been building that for quite some time. So are they the frontier technologies on solar? They're not. But they're about as good quality as anything else that's out there, and so having that supply chain, I think China's thinking, we're also going to be one of the biggest markets for clean tech, whether it's EVs or anything else, and that's going to be very powerful thing to have, I think. So they're definitely committed, because I think they look at it pretty much as sort of a industry and economic push. And we can get into even China's ultra high voltage transmission lines, but that's sort of another thing on its own. So yeah, I think it's absolutely part of. I don't think it's part of the common prosperity thing per se, but to resolve the principal contradiction, one of the key planks there is deploying capital into sort of these high tech supply chains, and that's really at the heart of what the supply side structural reforms were about. When they launched that a few years ago. And so let me try to take one more question, because we're running out of time almost. We didn't touch on this, Houze, and I thought we would get a question about that, which is, given U.S.-China tensions and obviously competition for sure, how will China develop technologies in leading industries like chips and biotech and so on? is this U.S.-China competitive dynamic a constraint or possibly also a facilitator?
I would say it's the net impact, probably marginally a facilitator.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. That's a bit of a, that's not necessarily the conventional wisdom. Why do you say that?
I would say that in the near term, it's probably, yes, all those tax export bans will definitely setback for China's high-tech semiconductors and AI. But I think over the longer term, because this also forced Beijing to care more about providing better incentives and better research environment for Chinese scientists and researchers. So my guess is there's definitely some long-term benefit, also like financing. China basically launched, just during the trade war, China launched its own NASDAQ equivalent stock board, which is used to finance, providing fundings for those high-tech firms. So if you add all these things together, there are pretty meaningful longer-term benefits from all those reforms.
Huh. So let me try to understand. Maybe we can end there because I think, there's obviously quite a bit of skepticism for a long time since the third plenum, since, even before that, the Chinese been talking about kind of, resetting their economic growth model. Hu Jintao and Zhao Dao talked about it right back in the day. So, this rebalancing idea, this transition idea isn't necessarily new. And so a lot of people have sort of said, and for the most part true, that they haven't really executed on it as much as they should have, and sort of kicking the can down the road. But it sounds like now they're a lot more serious about walking the walk on that. And I think maybe one way to think about that is because they are now, they feel intense pressure externally, that it's sort of, this competition has sort of shaken them out of their complacency, because they were sort of just coasting along on this way of doing things, as long as the consumption was there, well, they can just, keep on, ramping up exports or whatever. And so you have that exogenous pressure. And then domestically, if they're trying to manage a fairly significant economic transition, and they're trying to sell it as sort of, this is necessary for us to get to the national rejuvenation, that's necessary for us to get to the 30 trillion, $25,000. So they're sort of feeling a lot more, being compelled to actually do this. And, for the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps, because this is obviously going to be a very long process. It's not going to be done in 2 years. And, I think the past 9 years, it's shown that it's kind of occurred in fits and starts, and it hasn't been the most well managed execution process. But these things are not going to be perfectly well managed, obviously. But it seems like the commitment is there, because they're facing something that I think they feel is actually pressuring them to kind of counterintuitively shaking them out of their complacency a little bit, and they're trying to really execute on these things. So this story is going to be really interesting, I think. It's going to be more interesting than I think over the next few years than the previous years, because I think they're embarking on something pretty substantial, and it'll be inherently political. There's a lot of pieces involved. So we will have to kind of keep on looking at, I think, what will be a really fascinating development over the next several years. So why don't we end there, because we're running up against time. And thank you so much for tuning in and joining and asking all the questions. And if you have other follow-up questions, feel free to send them, or maybe we'll do a little bit of Twitter Q&A if there's still interest. But thank you so much, and we'll hopefully see you next time.